Today I'm going to give you the complete pattern for this cute little rabbit hat. It is sized for babies to middle-sized children. Here are the sizing standards according to the Craft Yarn Council. Of course, babies and children vary just like the rest of us, but these are standard head measurements at these ages. I will be giving you sizes for hats to fit heads up to 14, 16, and 18 inches. If you would like a written copy of this Hunny Bunny hat pattern, here is how to get it. Buy these two books as a bundle. They'll be bundled together on my website, and the Hunny Bunny hat pattern will be bundled along with them. The bundle will also be at a special price, reduced over the two books separately, so you're getting quite a deal. But it's not essential to buy anything because the pattern is complete in this movie. Here's the shape we'll be knitting. We'll start here and knit the hem, then knit on up, divide the work, do some decreasing, and finally bind off. Then knit the second half of the top as a mirror image of the first. Sew the two areas marked with a dotted line together to create the crown shaping at the back, and sew the two bound off edges together to complete the top. The hem itself will be 1 inch deep. Up the back, we'll have graduated lengths for the various sizes. We'll add worm trim to the front edge of the hat and separately knit the ears and sew them on. This is one of the movies in my 100 Recycled Hats series, but I can tell you that I remember what yarn I'm recycling, and it's this, Hirschner's Worsted 8. And I have only nice things to say about this yarn. I'll go into that in a yarn review video, but it's a wonderful worsted weight yarn. The gauge is 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. I'm working on a bulky machine and I'm getting that at stitch size 6. Some people can do fine on their mid-gauge machines also. You may use any worsted weight yarn that gets the gauge, but particularly if you're working on a mid-gauge, I strongly suggest using a soft yarn such as this one to avoid stress on the machine. Cast on by E-wrapping 42, 48, or 54 stitches. Those are for the small, medium, and large sizes, of course. E-wrap is just fine. Working at the main stitch size, make sure that your carriage is set to knit back from hold. Knit 12 rows, then hang the hem. You may hang every E-wrap or every other E-wrap. Either one will do a good enough job of closing the hem. Now knit 30, 34, or 36 straight rows depending on what size you're knitting. I'm knitting the small size, so I'm knitting 30 rows. When those rows are complete, place all the needles on the left half of the bed into hold. Make sure you set the carriage so it'll hold. We'll now knit 2 rows, then decrease 1 at the center, and repeat that, creating the angle that goes to the back of the head. You'll knit 2 rows, decrease 1. The decrease always occurs on the stitch that is closest to the held stitches. Move it over. Simple decrease is just fine. Depending on the size you're working on, repeat this action 6, 7, or 9 times. Your final decrease will occur after knitting row 42, 48, or 54. Now bind off all the stitches that just knitted, and then we'll move to the other side and repeat, creating a mirror image for the other side of the hat. Since the carriage is still set to hold needles that are all the way forward, you can just move it right across. Now the same thing again. Knit 2 rows, decrease 1, this time on the right. Do this 6, 7, or 9 times. After the final decrease, bind off. You may notice I latch tool bound off from the right, but working left to right, I'm using the transfer bind off. It's just easier for me, and they look just about alike. So here's the shape we have. Now, if possible, use the yarn tails and sew the diagonal decreases together and the top bound off edges together. So the hat is basically together. Now orient it so that the right side, which is the knit side, is towards the machine, the purl side is towards you, and start just above one of the hems. We'll hang a piece of edge on 3 needles, knit 6 rows, and repeat all the way around the front of the hat. You saw me just now doing a way of automatically weaving in a tail. Because I wrapped it around a couple of needles, I can just trim it off when I get the work off of the machine. Now, about the pace of the hanging for the worm trim. I got a nice fit by reducing the stitch size 1 whole number from my main stitch size. So I'm now at 5, and I'm hanging every other row on the needles. You can take some liberties with this. It may vary with the yarn that you use, and it might vary with how you're trying to fit the face. But as a general rule of thumb, what I just described worked nicely for this pattern. When you reach the second end of the hem, hang the last little piece of knitting just above the hem and then bind off. Pull all the yarn tails either inside the hem area or work them through an edge of the fabric so we can get rid of them all and snip them off now. Now let's knit some mock I-cord in order to have a drawstring at the bottom of the head that goes right through the hem. To do this, cast on 3 stitches, return to main stitch size, and just knit. Knit at least as much as the full circumference of the lower edge of the hat, and then at least that much again. I did that much again plus 3 or 4 inches. When complete, bind off those 3 stitches and work the yarn tails into the mock I-cord. I call it mock I-cord because it rolls up exactly like a regular I-cord does, but it isn't really a cord. Really, it's a thin strip of stockinette. Use a latch needle or a safety pin to work your mock I-cord through the hem of the hat. Now all we need is ears. We'll make 2 of these just alike. Bring forward 12 needles, E-wrap them, knit 4 rows, then work a full-fashioned increase on each side. To do that, move out each edge stitch 1 needle space and use some kind of tool. Here I'm using a little bent end tool to lift the purl bump from the previous row on the nearby stitch. I prefer to use the one towards the center of the knitting rather than the one that on the stitch I just moved out, and fill the empty needle. That'll create a no hole increase. We'll do that 3 times. So knit 4 rows, increase 1 on each side, knit 4 rows, increase 1 on each side, knit 4 rows, increase 1 on each side. Now begin decreasing. Knit 4 rows, decrease 1 on each side, knit 4 rows, decrease 1 on each side, and continue doing that until there are only 8 needles in work. So we've worked more decreases than we ever worked increases. After the final decrease, and the simple decrease is just fine, knit 4 additional rows, then count down to the 4th row below, and it's easy to see because you can see that last decrease. Lift the stitches from that row and hang them on the working needles. You can skip the 2 end needles, just makes it easier, and bind off. What we just did is create a teeny weeny hem at the top of the fabric, and we'll use that hem to do the finishing. To finish the ears, we need 2 pieces of wire. I'm using craft wire from, I think it was from Michael's. Anything that is not going to rust when you wash the hat is okay. Slide it through that tiny little hem, bend it in half, and where those knit edges curl together, stitch them together. It doesn't have to be very tight stitching. We just want to enclose the wire and go ahead and respect the naturally curling edges of the knitting. When the seam is finished, knot the yarn, of course, weave it into something part of the knitting, make sure all the wire is covered, and snip off the extra yarn. The position for the ears is somewhat up to personal taste. I'm deciding on it right now, choosing the top of the diagonal seam and about 1.5 inches away from the center seam. There should be 2 wires sticking out of the bottom of each ear. Poke them through the fabric and sew both layers of the fabric to the top of the head. Please forgive my grubby looking hands. I do wash them, but I've been working on knitting machines and in the garden today, and it's more staining than the soap can handle. The second ear should go on in a position that matches the first on the other side of the top seam and also get sewn on securely. So now there are 4 wires poking down into the hat. Fold the 2 pairs of wires towards the center seam, cross them at the center seam, fold them back out towards the ears, and then insert all the pointy ends back up into the ears and make sure they stay buried inside the ear. And I almost forgot to mention, you could orient the ears either direction. I put the side with the seam towards the back, but there's an argument for a good look either way. It's super important, though, that these raw ends of wire get tucked out of the way of the child's head. Lightly stitch down the wires after checking that the ears are adjusted in a way that you like. If the hat is going to be worn just very briefly, say for a picture, that may be enough. But if it's really going to be a hat that's used, I recommend that we add a little protective flap. To make that, cast on 6 stitches and knit a strip of cloth long enough to cover the entire distance that there is wire extending between the ears. It's going to vary a little bit depending on where you exactly decided to place the ears, so check against the hat. I have almost enough, decided that 2 more rows would do it, and now it's time to bind off. Lay the strip of fabric on the inside of the hat over the overlapping wires and stitch it lightly down to the main hat fabric, making bigger, stronger stitches at the seam, which will hold it, because we want inconspicuous stitches into the hat fabric. Tuck any stray pieces of yarn that are still in the area underneath the flap of the fabric we're sewing on, because they're actually going to be helpful in terms of cushioning the person's head against the wires. When finished, secure the yarn tail and weave it in by poking it underneath the flap that you just sewed on. The ears may be bent to give the rabbit some personal expression. You are looking at the ears described in the pattern on the smallest size of hat. For the 2 larger sizes, if you wanted to, you could knit 5 rows or even 6 instead of 4 between each increase and decrease. If you decide to do so, it may take a little bit of experimentation to discover how long you can go before the ears really can't be supported by the hat. That's why I designed it with relatively small ears.